Hello there, sword friends. I am on holiday, and I asked everyone who was interested to submit questions to me related to swords, because even on holiday, what I think is fun is talking about swords. So I'm going to go through and look at prior YouTube comments that maybe I missed, and anything that someone has asked that is a sword-related question, and just see if I can answer it off the top of my head. So let's go through the comments that we have here and see what we've asked before. Oh, it looks like I've scrolled all the way to the end of the comment section, but we'll just run through real fast and see what anyone has. So, Mitsu Shuri asks, any word on the history of the Shotel? So I haven't discussed the Shotel on my channel before. It's an Ethiopian sword. We at some point we'll get more into African swords in general, but there's a variety of different types of Ethiopian swords. It does go back at least a little ways, and it remained in use until the military reforms that went on in Ethiopia in the 19th, in the late 19th century, and you can still see them being carried, if not in the military of Ethiopia, then by the kind of like tribal groups that existed in there during imperial Ethiopia in the early 20th century. And it's kind of neat because there are a couple of different types of saber that exist in Ethiopia. The Shotel is the most famous one, and it's edged on two sides, and it looks like a sickle. So the assumption is it can be used to like hook and pull back a shield and bring it over. But the depictions that we have of it actually indicate that it may have been used on the belly as the primary type of cutting side. So anytime it's depicted either in film or art, the majority of the time it's depicted being used on the side that is curved outward, much like a very deeply curved saber. It doesn't mean it can't be used the other way, because again, it is edged on both sides. So more research needs to be done there. Perhaps you can switch it back and forth. One of the cool things about it is the hilt is pretty um, symmetrical, so that you can switch it back and forward, kind of like an arming sword. So perhaps it just has a lot of utility built into it, where you're able to switch it back and forth both ways, depending as the need arises. How far back it goes, there is some Ethiopian artwork that goes back quite a ways. I don't want to give a date to it off the top of my head, but certainly before the 18th century, and probably a couple of hundred years before that. So it's an older design. It doesn't go back thousands of years, but you know, probably getting towards the Renaissance, I'd say, as far as that's concerned. Let's see who else has something on here. So, is this a comment talking about me? That one was not talking about me. Some folks that are okay. So this guy is asking about locations to train. So as I've mentioned a couple of times before, I don't actively do any fencing. So if you are interested in learning how to fence formally, I recommend you, especially European style fencing, then I recommend you use the HEMA Club Finder, and you're going to find the best fencing locations that are closest to you and get actual proper formal instruction. It's great to see what other people are doing online, either by reading on blog posts or watching videos on Facebook, YouTube, what have you. But it's never going to be a substitute for actual in-person uh, working with others who are going through at a similar level, working with a resistant opponent, and working alongside a competent instructor who is able to watch what you're doing and be able to critique your form and give you tips for how to improve, and homework for you to work on both in class and when you're not there. So if you're serious about actually doing anything resembling actual swordplay instead of just swinging swords around and working on targets in the backyard, I definitely recommend you spend some time and find a club of whatever type of swordplay you're interested in, whether it's Japanese, Chinese, European. That may not always be possible, just because swordsmanship isn't the most common thing in the world, so do the best you can. Even if it's not exactly what you're interested in, that will get you a lot closer than doing nothing or just doing it by yourself. So even if all you have is something like kendo or Olympic fencing, even that, getting your foot in the door, is going to teach you a lot of the core mechanics and principles behind swordplay that you will not be able to get if you're trying to do it on your own. So I would always encourage you to take that step first. So let's see what else we have. Ricardo Montalban says, nice scabbard, always like those blade type 10s. They can start to get a bit boring, but those look good. So he's referring to I believe, a Valiant Armory Type 10 that we opened recently that admittedly looks very, very lovely. Valiant Armory is well known for having gorgeous scabbards. It's at the price that they're producing it, sometimes the quality of the scabbard they're making could be sold just for the price of the entire package, the sword and the scabbard. So you almost get a sword for free for the price of the scabbard that they are producing. And the quality of the swords that Valiant Armory makes is tremendous. So together, the combination that you have in buying from Valiant Armory is quite good. If obviously they don't have every type of design, but if the designs that they are producing are of interest to you, I highly recommend taking a look at them. They're starting to make a better name for themselves, but I think that for many, many years they've been overshadowed by the likes of Albion and haven't had the chance to shine. But that is changing bit by bit. So let's see what else we have here. Someone comments on the review of the LK Chen Majestic Wang Taichi Yao Dao. Cinnabar is indeed what was used to dye the fuller of the historic sword that this is replicating, but I would assume that LK Chen probably used something less toxic to replicate the look. So thank you to Red um, 16 for commenting that. Yeah, so historically, Cinnabar is a dye that was used in a lot of East Asia in order to manufacture this kind of strong red coloring. And we see that used in the fullering on especially Chinese and Japanese blades. We occasionally will see it in the blades of other cultures as well. But yes, well, it can be used today as well. The manufacturing of that as a type of dye and lacquering together is not without risk. So I would hope that people, especially they're doing it for dozens of blades or even more, would use something slightly less toxic. Um, we have let's see if we have another one or two. Um, uh, When will LK Chen create Chinese axe, which might be given up for more than 1 or 2,000 years? So that's by KH Alani 2013. That's a question for LK Chen. I don't have any insight as to if he's going to do a Chinese axe. Now, he's specifically saying it might be given up for 1 or 2,000 years. So maybe he's interested in very old types of axe. And there may even be a translation error going on there. So he might want to revisit what that question is, perhaps, or write it in his native tongue. Because there are things that are axe-like, halberds, for example, that are quite old. So if he's talking about 1,000 years ago, that's during roughly the Song dynasty or the Song going into the Yuan dynasty, perhaps, somewhere in that period. And there are various types of axe and halberd that were used during that period. If he's talking about 2,000 years ago, that's the Chinese Han dynasty. And again, there are types of axe with either hand axe or axe mounted on poles that were used there of a completely different configuration. So axes were military weapons. They weren't as common in Chinese history as they were perhaps in European history, but we see them used from the Bronze Age all the way up through the modern period. They never really go away. They just aren't perhaps quite as noticeable or prevalent. So in European history, you have the Viking period, and there are axes all over the place, and they turn into the big Dane axes, and then eventually they turn into halberds. So they're always some form of axe around. In China, you do have axe, but then you also get other types of polearm, and the Chinese polearms get very, very creative compared to their European counterparts. So the need for axe perhaps is less because there are other things. So if you think about it in Europe, there were halberds, but halberds were mostly popular in kind of Central Europe, where the closer you get to the Holy Roman Empire in Germany. Whereas if you go into France, you'll see glaives, and if you go over into England, you'll see billhooks. So there was still variety of those polearm types even within Europe, and the same thing happens in China. So yes, axes do exist, but instead you have things like the P, like the kind of moon type of glaive. So sometimes those are called Chinese polearms. You have the tiger forks, the big kind of trident looking sort of things. You have many different types of spear. You have the kind of snake headed spear. There's an incredible variety of pole arms, especially from like the Ming Dynasty onwards. We have descriptions of them and even surviving accounts of them. So I'm not sure exactly which type of axe, whether you're talking about just a simple hand axe. And again, there are depictions of warriors or village militia going out, some of them armed with swords, some of them armed with dao, some of them armed with bar maces, and other of them armed with axe, sometimes with two axes. So you have guys going out crazily running around with two axes. So it certainly was a weapon that could be encountered in different parts of China's history. Um, can you please give feedback on the branding of the new sword on the LK Chen models? I have offered my feedback to LK Chen on the branding that he is using. Anyone else, feel free to offer your own opinions to LK Chen on the position that he is offering to LK Chen on the new on his swords. When will you review these three 1796 sabres? All right, so I have delayed as to when that's going on. So, as a preview, I have filmed some footage of the 1796 sabres, but I have shipped them out to another reviewer who is going to be doing their own review of them. And I think that I'll try and synchronize my review and their review for them going on at the same time. So, watch that coming up in the hopefully not too distant future. They're going to be. We'll do a review of all three swords at the same time, so you can compare the windlass, the LK Chen 1796, and the Cold Steel 1796 light cavalry saber. They're all three. I'll say this much: all three are usable, but they come in at different price points, and they do have different performances and aesthetics. So there is enough there to need to compare them each against one another. Then we have, I can't pronounce that name, so I'm going to call him Ren, since his whole name is rather long. Ren says a 600 gram jian is not a real sword. A minimum should be 750 grams, ideally closer to 1,000 grams. Now, he's commenting this on a video where I was comparing the Scarlet Sunrise jian to a Viking sword. I can see how someone might think that a 600 gram sword is not a real sword. The it 600 grams is quite light, and I wanted to showcase what that sword could do, and it performs very well in that video. Now, I have independently reviewed historical antique gen to see how they kind of weigh and what their distribution is. 600 grams is kind of at the very bottom end of antique gens that I have looked at that are full size. There are lighter gens that I've studied, but they're shorter. They're Duangen size. And they start at, let's say, 600, 650 grams. It can go up to around 1,000, maybe 1,200 grams, depending on how big they are. So there's a really big range for them, but certainly below 750 grams. So this is one of those things where you will have a preconception in your mind of a certain type of sword, and you'll say, "Oh, a sword has to be X size, or X length, or X weight, and if it doesn't meet those stats, then I'm not even going to pay attention to it." And that's very common, especially if you're looking at modern reproduction. Sometimes that happens in the historical record. The most common example of that is Uchikatana in the Edo period, and the surviving examples of Uchikatana are very, very closely set as far as what their like lengths and weights are. They seem to have really honed in on a certain size that they really, really like, and the distribution for surviving ones is highly concentrated. But in many periods of time, there was a huge distribution of sword sizes and range. And as a result, you can get swords that were really, really long, really, really short, really, really heavy, really, really thin. So there's all sorts of things, even within one quote-unquote type of sword. And in this case, even if someone thinks they know what a Chinese jian was like, in most cases, they're thinking about a kind of later period Qing dynasty jian. And those have an expected kind of range and distribution. But in the video I was talking about, that was a reproduction of a sword from the Jin dynasty, which was 1,500 years earlier than the Qing dynasty swords that most people are used to. And they are a very different type. They're very, very, very long and very, very narrow and relatively thin. They're almost like a rapier blade, like a real thin, itty-bitty rapier blade. So yeah, that's a representative sword that LK Chen has reproduced. It's a little conjectural because we don't have many swords from that period. We have some surviving ones from Japan that seem to match up what LK Chen has reproduced. But it's a light sword, and it functions beautifully, and it operates just fine for the role that it seems to have needed to operate within. I have a bunch of folks that are commenting very nicely with the talk I conducted with James Elmslie. There will be at least one follow-up video on that. I'm not going to respond to any of the questions that came out of any of that video series because I want a chance for Mr. Elmslie to be able to respond to them directly, since I'm not the either Messer or falchion expert. So feel free to, if you have questions related to Messers or falchions or any of the topics we've talked about, please continue to comment on any of those videos, and he and I will get to those in kind. Then what else do we have over here? JC Owens comments, I would say this is more of a both and situation rather than either or. Oh, I see. He was talking about how the performance is between curved and straight swords. So, spoiler alert, we will be doing more on that topic. My arm is rehabilitating. Again, I am avoiding any rigorous sword-related activity. Mostly I'm trying to get this elbow working again. Seems to be going well. So hopefully we'll be seeing more swinging in the not-too-distant future. Okay. Francisco Finari 2343 says, I have a question. It's about blade geometry. How much does fullers affect the stiffness of a blade and its cutting ability if compared to a diamond? So I assume he's talking about looking at a diamond cross-section blade compared to a blade with fullering in it. So you have to be a little bit careful, because if you take two blades side by side and one is an enfoldered blade and one is a diamond cross-section blade, and he's asking about their relative stiffness, you could have two blades and they could both be equally stiff, even if one is diamond cross-section and one is fullered. So you have to think about it differently. You have to think about how these swords are being produced. Are you talking about a sword that started as a diamond and then you ground fullers into it? Or are you talking about the same amount of metal that was a diamond cross-section and then you hammered it flat and spread it out into putting a fuller in the middle? Because that is usually how things are done. So You say that fullers are weight-saving techniques? Yes. So if we're talking about equal amounts of metal, a sword that has a fuller hammered into it will be wider than the diamond cross-section blade because it has a big channel put into the middle of it. Now, if you're talking about grinding a fuller out, you're pulling metal out of it. You have less material there. There's less mass. The sword will be lighter in absolute terms. So it's just like you pulled strips out of it. It'll be just as wide as it was before, but now you've just peeled pieces out of it. By definition, there will be less material there and it will be less stiff. Now, it's a way to minimize how much stiffness you lose while keeping the cutting ability. So there are other ways you could make it lighter. You could make it even flatter. You could cut one side off and just have it a triangle instead, and you can still have the same cutting ability, but that might make it even floppier. So in that particular scenario, that is a way that you could retain as much of the stiffness as possible while making the blade lighter and still having it have all of its cutting ability. So it is a way to conserve some of the mechanical properties of the sword while making it lighter, if you're talking about grinding fullers into it. But again, there's a little bit of an apples and oranges component because that's not usually how you put the fullers in. Usually you start by forging the fullers in, by hammering it, by pushing the material out. Sometimes you'll do some grinding, but it depends. Like, is it a little Japanese bogie where you're actually sitting there and chiseling the tiny little fullers in to make it lighter? Or is it a big, wide fuller on a Viking period sword where you're sitting there with a flat billet and you're hammering it down and squishing the material out to the side? So they're very different sorts of situations. Harry Stanton 205 asks, are false edge cuts from asymmetric blades like Messers and falchions more effective than false edge cuts with straight blades? Are they more effective from falchions than with straight blades? Whoo, boy! Are they more effective? Short answer is no with an if. Long answer is yes with a but. This is very, very complicated because there's so many different types of false edges out there. I mean, if we look at the 19th century alone, there's probably dozens of different types of false edges that you can find on single-edged swords. So to categorically say how is a false edge going and a false edge cut going to perform compared to a double-edged sword is really, really tricky. You're specifically asking about falchions and messers. And again, as we saw in the previous messer videos, there's a whole lot of different types of messers. And we only have a small sampling of falchions, so trying to say anything about how falchions will perform is really, really difficult. In general, having a false edge on those type of swords allows you to perform little sneaky back actions. But it doesn't give you a lot of cutting material. So if the primary edge has this much distance to taper and perform this huge, wonderful cutting edge, so over this amount of distance, and we're looking at the cross section of the blade. So imagine I have my falchion edge is blown up, and this is the spine, and it's this wide, and I'm running down to an edge, and so it's this huge, nasty wedge. Then on the back edge, I only have this distance. And so it goes down to a false edge over here. So it still can be sharp over here, but it's usually a much steeper angle. And so, or a more obtuse angle, I should say, which means it's not at nearly as fearsome in the cut. And just from a mechanic standpoint, the type of cuts you're delivering are usually not as aggressive. Whereas if we change the point to the middle, and now you're symmetrical, now we're a diamond cross section, you're more or less uniform. So you're cutting just as well on this side as well as that side. It's not as good as the falchion cross section we just looked at, so it's not as aggressive, but it's just as good on either side. Now, there are some really sneaky things you can do with false edges, especially with deeply curved blades. I don't specialize in that. I'm going to link to a video made by Russ Mitchell um, from Hungarian uh, from Russ Mitchell's historical fencing. I can't speak right now, where he shows that you can, depending on the type of sword, the furniture and the curvature, you can use leverage to really scissor um, false edges and produce tremendous amount of energy into the wrist and hand with the false edges, which is you can't really do the same way with a straight sword. So there are some opportunities for false edges that can be really mean, but in general, I would say no. That's not generally speaking. The a double edged sword will cut basically just as well forward and back, although you can't always. It depends on how you can set up your false edge attack. And generally speaking, the false edges of falchions and messers will not cut as well as those symmetrical blades. Generally speaking, there are plenty of opportunities that will probably show that to be wrong. And we'll wrap it up with this one. A nice, easy question. What is the difference? So Ben Knight asked, what's the difference between center of percussion versus blade node? So we will link another hyperlink. So I will link an article by Vincent Le Chevalier, who will give you the master's level class going into what center of percussion means. If you want the kindergarten version, center of percussion is a really difficult to explain term. It means different things to different audiences. So in the sword community, we usually mean one thing, although even depending on who you talk to, it can mean very different things. Blade node is a little bit easier. So a blade node is the harmonic point, and there's actually a couple of different ones, because if you think of, let's say this is my cutting portion of the blade node is the harmonic point. So if you hit the hilt here, you'll send a wave down the blade, and there'll be a spot in the hilt where it doesn't vibrate, and there'll be a spot here in the blade where it doesn't vibrate, where it kind of just sits still and it wobbles about it. And you'll have one in the plane of the edge, and you'll have one in the plane of the flat. So one in the edge plane, one in the flat plane. They're usually around the same spot, but just be aware that there's more than one blade node. So usually it's around about a third of the way back from the tip is where you find the blade node. The center of percussion, originally it was the same thing as the center of oscillation, and it had to do with the point that the sword was moving around the center of rotation. Nowadays, it usually tends to mean the point at which you're striking with the sword, where you feel the least amount of impact in the hand. And that can be caused by a variety of different things. So it can oftentimes be a very similar spot to the harmonics node that we were just talking about. But it also has to do with the action points. So when you see my videos of me waggling the swords, the action points where the sword tends to pivot, not move, that has to do with the inertial forces of the sword, where the sword is balanced, the distribution of mass. That contributes to it, but it also has to do with where the hilt is put together and the like. Essentially, either how the sword is being swung, so it either has to do with how you're swinging the sword, so whether you're swinging it from the elbow or the wrist or the hand, or where it where the action point is relative to where you're gripping it in the hand. And either of those things can coincide possibly with the vibrational node. What people who have studied this have tried to determine is where you need to strike with the sword in order to cause the most damage, basically the meatiest spot with the sword. oftentimes these points all hover kind of in the same spot, but they're not exactly in the same spot necessarily. They're often within a couple centimeters of each other on the blade, and it's a little confusing. So they're similar. They can all overlap, but they're not necessarily the same thing from a physics standpoint. So the center of percussion means different things to different people. Most of the time, people think of it as the spot where the sword hits hardest, but that can be dependent on what type of sword you have, how you're holding it, and how you're swinging it. And it can change on the blade. And it also depends on what audience you're talking to. I have historically avoided on this channel referring to the center of percussion when measuring the sword. Sometimes I'll refer to the sweet spot on the sword because oftentimes it's a small kind of medium-ish area, and I can just say this area here is where it's going to cut the best, and it's just the sweet spot of the sword. So sometimes I use that term. I'm sure that was clear as mud. Maybe we'll explore the term further when we have some actual swords instead of just my hands waving in the air to explain things. Okay, I hope that was fun. If anyone found this interesting, drop some comments, drop some questions. Maybe I'll have time and I'll record another